In this large city in the United States, summer weighed on the boiling arteries.
The sun beat down mercilessly, transforming the sidewalks into glistening asphalt mirrors, as if they had come from the earth itself.
Lazy clouds, hanging on the horizon, seemed to watch the teeming streets, but offered little respite from the heat wave. The noises of the city mixed with a heavy atmosphere, creating an almost suffocating setting. People hurried along under the shadows of the buildings, but the light was relentless. The air seemed to twist on itself, saturated with heat, transforming the city into an open oven. In this urban maelstrom, the shopping streets were filled with people wandering between stores, restaurants, and small stalls, some seeking to cool off in the air conditioning, others hurrying towards their destination. But at the corner of a deserted street, where tall buildings gave way to older buildings, the atmosphere would suddenly take on an invisible tension. An event would emerge, and with it, upset everything that was established. It was there, in this less frequented place, that Agent Thompson and Agent Miller, two police officers on patrol, decided to establish their own form of order. They were no strangers to the predominantly African-American neighborhoods they frequently visited, and their presence, as was often the case, was marked by blatant contempt and arrogance. They felt untouchable, protected by their uniform and by a system which, in their eyes, allowed them to exercise unlimited control. These neighborhoods, which they considered difficult, were where they were accustomed to relegating the laws to their own interpretation. Far from being there to protect, they were there to subdue. They were in a bad mood that day, and the oppressive heat didn't help. The police, already weighed down by their prejudices and the routine of arbitrary arrests, paused on the street corner. Their gaze landed on a well-dressed black man walking confidently down the sidewalk. The man was accompanied by another, also in an elegant suit. Their calm, their dignity, and the way they wore their outfits contrasted with the harshness of the urban scene. What they didn't know at the time was that these two men were not just ordinary passers-by. They were army captains, men decorated for their courage on mission and their exceptional service to the nation. But today, on this street, they would become targets, victims of a system that saw them primarily as a threat because of their skin color. Agent Thompson, whose cold gaze pierced people with contempt, stepped forward. His attitude was that of a man who, in the shadow of his uniform, believed that the world belonged to him. He approached James Carter, the 45-year-old captain, a calm and thoughtful man, known in those around him for his charisma and iron discipline. The other, Malcolm Stevens, 40, more energetic and impulsive, but just as respected in the army, followed his friend, a solid and determined figure. "You two, stop. Do you have any ID?" Agent Miller said sharply, as if he needed to justify his power by harassing those who seemed suspicious to him. The tone was neither cordial nor respectful, but there was a sense of a desire to dominate, to impose a hierarchy. Captain Carter, never having been accustomed to such aggression, replied calmly, "Why is that? We are doing nothing wrong." His face remained impassive, but in his eyes one could read confusion, incomprehension in the face of such arbitrary treatment. "You look suspicious," Thompson replied, his gaze hardening.
"Show your papers."
It was no longer a question, but an order, an unfounded demand. He hadn't even bothered to check the military badges the two men wore proudly. To him, these men were nothing more than blacks on his territory. The two captains, although taken aback by the sudden aggression, were preparing to present their identifiers. They knew that their military status, although imposing, would not change the situation. But before they could react, Miller, with the brutality that characterized his methods, seized them without warning. "I told you to stop," he yelled, his voice betraying an irrational build-up of pressure, as his hand pinned Stevens against the police car. Captain Carter lunged to separate the two men, but in a flash, Miller overpowered him as well, pinning him violently against the hood. The blows rained down, not because there was any legitimacy, but because power was now in the hands of the police, and their racial hatred was expressed without restraint.
The sound of cracks and screams mixed with the echo of the silent streets.
Passers-by, shocked by the scene, took out their phones. Some filmed, others did not even dare to intervene. But soon the scene went viral. The video spread like wildfire on social media, capturing the humiliation of the two men. This video, these images of gratuitous violence, crossed borders, and what should have been an isolated scene in a neighborhood of the city became a symbol of the systemic oppression that was corrupting the entire country. The reactions were immediate. Barely hours after the incident, protests began. Angry citizens, but also civil rights groups, activists and veterans mobilized. Calls for justice rang out, not only in the city streets but across the country. The neighborhood where the two captains grew up became a hotbed of revolt. Signs denouncing systemic racism were held up. Chants of unity and solidarity echoed in the hot summer air. Hundreds of voices united in anger, not only against the actions of police officers, but also against a system that allowed officers like Thompson and Miller to abuse their power without fear of consequences. The army, informed of the attack, was quick to react. The military spokesperson, a respected colonel, addressed the nation in a press conference, publicly denouncing the behavior of the police officers. What these men suffered is a disgrace, not only to those who treated them this way, but to the entire nation, he declared firmly. Respect, dignity and honor must come first, and what was done to these captains will not go unanswered. The words of General Richard Wilson, war veteran and civil rights activist, resonated powerfully. Unity and respect must be at the heart of our nation, and what was done to these men will not be tolerated. The police officers, Thompson and Miller, believed themselves protected by their status and the influence they exercised in the city. They were accustomed to their impunity, to the way their abuse of power went unnoticed, to the confidence that years of racist behavior without consequences gave them. However, this time, they were seriously mistaken. In the space of a few hours, a veritable wind of anger blew throughout the nation, fueled by millions of people outraged by the brutality of their act. Their immediate superiors were overwhelmed by popular and political pressure. The internal investigation, which initially seemed like a formality, took a more complex turn. Incessant calls, messages of support for the victims, massive demonstrations in front of police offices, and the sudden appearance of unprecedented media pressure highlighted the extent of the problem. Each hour that passed made their position more untenable. The police, feeling the storm building around them, decided to retreat into a defensive posture, hoping that their reputation and experience would be enough to cover up the affair. But they did not anticipate the devastating impact of the massive support that arose for Captains Carter and Stevens. Former military comrades of the two captains began to organize. Soldiers of varied origins and backgrounds, from all corners of the country, came together to support the two men whom they considered not only war heroes but also victims of an unjust system. This support, at first discreet, quickly transformed into an organized force. Veterans began distributing leaflets, organizing rallies and contacting the media, increasing pressure on the state apparatus and civilian authorities. Captains Carter and Stevens, after their release on bail, appeared at a press conference. Their faces, marked by pain but also by dignity, symbolized the very honor of the fight they had led for their country, a fight which, today, was transposed into a broader fight against racial injustice. Malcolm Stevens, with his penetrating gaze and serious voice, declared in front of the cameras, "We have been victims of humiliation, racism, and abuse of power. But our fight is not just for us. It is for all people everywhere who suffer under a racist and oppressive system. We must fight to make this pain end." These words resonated throughout the country, and the effect was immediate. A colossal media campaign began. Celebrities, politicians, and community leaders spoke out against police brutality and racial discrimination. But what really upset the balance of power was the military's radical decision. After reviewing the evidence and taking into account public opinion, it demanded the immediate dismissal of Agent Thompson and Agent Miller. In a few hours, the mobilization of the army, which firmly supported the cause of the two captains, had a decisive impact. The government, trapped between popular pressure and the influence of the army, finally gave in and announced the opening of a trial against the two police officers. The widely publicized trial attracted an impressive crowd to the courtroom. Journalists, civil rights activists, public figures, and hundreds of supporters of the two captains filled the ranks. Carter and Stevens' lawyer, a respected former prosecutor, set the bar high from the start of his argument. He vigorously denounced the police violence and the attack on the honor of the two men. These police officers have dishonored the memory of those who served this country. They have trampled on the commitment and sacrifice of two heroes, he declared. The police found themselves facing a defense that was as arrogant as it was fragile. Their lawyer tried to downplay the incident, arguing that the officers had acted within the scope of their duties and that the violence was a justified reaction to a tense situation. But the evidence was overwhelming. The video of the incident, filmed by a passerby, showed the excessive brutality of the police, their aggressive and racist behavior. Witness testimony, as well as previous complaints of discriminatory behavior filed against Thompson and Miller, reflected an alarming history. The verdict came quickly. The two police officers were found guilty of abuse of power, racial discrimination, and assault. The sentence was firm, a prison sentence for the two agents, as well as the revocation of their badges. The image of these two police officers, once untouchable, chained and taken from the courtroom, was a powerful symbol of the victory of justice. The protests, which began in the city streets, quickly spread across the country. Thousands of people joined calls for reform of the justice and police systems. The signs demanded an end to institutional racism, the decolonization of the police force, and the establishment of stricter control mechanisms over the police. This wave of protest became a national movement, a cry of anger and hope, demanding profound and immediate reforms. Malcolm Stevens and James Carter, despite the pain and humiliation they had suffered, were now symbols of the fight against oppression. Their story was a catalyst for collective awareness of systemic abuses of power. Their courage and dignity in the face of injustice inspired a generation of young people to stand up and defend their rights. As the city calmed down after the protests, the legacy of the captain's fight had only just begun. Their struggle was not limited to a personal confrontation with racist police officers. She had become a reference in the fight for a fairer society, where equality and dignity would finally be granted to all, without distinction of skin color or status. The victory of Stevens and Carter thus marked the beginning of a deeper change, that of recognition of the power of voices that had been suppressed for too long.